When did desperation become the most honest emotion in professional football? As the final roster cut-down deadline looms like a guillotine over NFL front offices, three franchises are frantically dialing phones and making last-minute pitches that reek of panic more than strategy. The New York Jets, San Francisco 49ers, and Minnesota Vikings have all joined what's shaping up to be the most frenzied wide receiver trade market in recent memory, and their collective scramble reveals just how badly these organizations have mismanaged one of football's most crucial positions. The urgency is palpable, the stakes are enormous, and the desperation is impossible to hide. When established NFL teams are making emergency calls just days before rosters must be finalized, it's a clear admission that their offseason planning failed spectacularly. These aren't calculated moves by confident organizations. These are Hail Mary attempts by teams that suddenly realized they're about to enter a gunfight with water pistols. Let's start with the most obvious disaster zone: the New York Jets wide receiver room. If you're looking for a textbook example of how not to build around your quarterback, look no further than Gang Green's current situation. Garrett Wilson stands alone as a legitimate NFL starter, carrying the burden of being the sole, reliable target in what should be a diverse, dynamic passing attack. The drop-off after Wilson is nothing short of alarming. Josh Reynolds, listed as the team's second receiver, represents the kind of veteran Band-Aid solution that screams, "We have no real plan." Reynolds isn't a difference maker, he's a placeholder. Meanwhile, Allen Lazard's presence as the third option feels more like a cruel joke than a strategic decision. The former Packers receiver has shown flashes of competence but lacks the consistency and explosiveness needed to threaten NFL secondaries on a weekly basis. This receiver core construction becomes even more problematic when you consider the Jets' quarterback situation. Whether Justin Fields or Aaron Rodgers is under center, both signal callers need multiple reliable targets to operate effectively. Fields, in particular, relies heavily on his receiver's ability to create separation and win contested catches, skills that become infinitely more valuable when defenses can't simply bracket Wilson and force throws to inferior options. The Jets' desperation isn't just about depth, it's about basic offensive functionality. In today's NFL, teams routinely deploy 3 and 4 receiver sets, meaning New York needs at least 4 serviceable options to run a modern passing attack. Currently, they have 1 elite player, 1 adequate veteran, and a collection of question marks that wouldn't start for most college programs. What makes this situation particularly frustrating for Jets fans is that it was entirely predictable and preventable. The organization had an entire offseason to address receiver depth, either through the draft, free agency, or trades. Instead, they chose to roll the dice with a group that looks more like a practice squad than a professional receiving corps. The 49ers find themselves in a completely different, but equally precarious situation. The Deebo Samuel trade marked the end of an era in San Francisco, shifting the offensive identity and placing enormous pressure on Brandon Ayuk to carry the receiver room. Unfortunately, Ayuk's disastrous 2024 season, culminated by a season-ending ACL tear, has left the 49ers scrambling to find viable alternatives. Ayuk's struggles represent more than just individual disappointment. They've exposed the fragility of San Francisco's entire offensive philosophy. The 49ers have built their system around precise route running, timing, and chemistry between quarterback and receivers. When your primary receiver is unreliable or unavailable, the entire offensive ecosystem begins to crumble. The supporting cast behind Ayuk reads like a collection of developmental projects and reclamation attempts. Jawan Jennings has shown flashes, but lacks the explosive playmaking ability needed to consistently threaten NFL secondaries. Rookie Ricky Pearsall represents potential rather than production, and asking a first-year player to immediately contribute at a high level is a gamble that rarely pays off. Demarcus Robinson rounds out the group as a veteran presence, but his ceiling is well established, and it's not particularly high. What's particularly concerning about San Francisco's situation is how it could impact their offensive coordinator's play calling. Kyle Shanahan's system relies heavily on having multiple viable receiving options to create the spacing and matchup advantages that make his schemes so effective. Without reliable depth at receiver, Shanahan may be forced to simplify his approach or rely more heavily on running backs and tight ends, fundamentally altering the team's offensive identity. The 49ers' urgency in the trade market reflects their understanding that receiver is no longer a luxury position, it's a necessity for offensive success. In a division featuring teams like the Rams and Seahawks, who boast dynamic passing attacks, San Francisco can't afford to enter the season with question marks at such a crucial position. The Vikings' situation represents the most understandable form of desperation. Jordan Addison's extended absence has created an immediate hole in their offensive plans, forcing the organization to reassess their receiver depth just weeks before the season begins. Unlike the Jets and 49ers, whose problems stem from poor roster construction, Minnesota's issues are largely circumstantial. However, the Vikings' scramble highlights a broader issue with how NFL teams approach depth at skill positions. In today's league, where injuries are inevitable and receivers are targeted more frequently than ever before, carrying adequate depth isn't just smart, it's essential for survival. The fact that one injury can send a team into panic mode suggests that their initial roster construction was more fragile than it appeared. Justin Jefferson's presence as a legitimate superstar receiver provides Minnesota with a foundation that neither New York nor San Francisco can match. However, even elite players can't single-handedly carry an entire passing attack, especially when opposing defenses can focus their attention on eliminating the primary threat. The Vikings need multiple, viable options to prevent defenses from bracketing Jefferson and daring other receivers to beat them. The timing of Minnesota's search is particularly problematic. With roster cutdowns approaching, available players are likely to be those who couldn't make their original team's final rosters. While diamonds in the rough occasionally emerge from these late-stage acquisitions, more often than not, available players are available for good reasons. The widespread desperation among these three teams creates fascinating opportunities for organizations with receiver depth. The Buffalo Bills, Cincinnati Bengals, and New England Patriots suddenly find themselves in enviable positions, holding assets that multiple teams desperately need. Buffalo's situation is particularly intriguing. The Bills have cultivated impressive receiver depth, with players like Keon Coleman, Khalil Shakir, Curtis Samuel, and Joshua Palmer all capable of contributing immediately for receiver-needy teams. The challenge for Buffalo will be determining which players they can afford to part with while maintaining their own offensive effectiveness. The Bengals face a different calculation. While they won't trade their top receivers, players like Jermaine Burton or Mitchell Tinsley could provide immediate value to desperate teams. Cincinnati's ability to develop receiver talent means they can afford to move depth pieces for valuable draft compensation or players at positions of need. New England's Kendrick Bourne represents exactly the type of veteran presence that could appeal to teams like the Jets or 49ers. Bourne brings experience, reliability, and the kind of professional approach that can stabilize a questionable receiver room. His availability could trigger a bidding war among teams that need immediate help. What makes this situation particularly fascinating is how each team's desperation could impact the others. If one organization makes an aggressive move early, it could drive up prices for the remaining available players, forcing other teams to either overpay or settle for inferior options. The Jets' situation seems most urgent, given their complete lack of reliable depth behind Wilson. Their willingness to overpay could set market prices that make it difficult for San Francisco or Minnesota to find affordable solutions. Conversely, if multiple teams are pursuing the same limited pool of available players, it could create an auction atmosphere that benefits sellers while leaving some buyers empty-handed. The timing element adds another layer of complexity. Teams making moves closer to the cut-down deadline have less time to integrate new players into their systems, potentially limiting the immediate impact of any acquisitions. However, waiting too long also risks missing out on the best available options as other teams act more decisively. The receiver market scramble isn't just about depth, it's about championship aspirations. All three teams enter the season with playoff expectations, and their ability to address receiver needs could determine whether they compete for titles or struggle to reach the postseason. The Jets' championship window appears limited, making their receiver situation particularly critical. With an aging roster and significant salary cap investments in key players, they can't afford to waste a season due to inadequate supporting cast construction. Their desperation reflects an understanding that this might be their best opportunity for success in the foreseeable future. San Francisco's championship timeline is similarly compressed. Kyle Shanahan's offensive system and the team's overall talent level suggest they should be contending immediately, but receiver deficiencies could derail those plans. The 49ers have invested too heavily in their current core to accept mediocrity due to preventable roster weaknesses. Minnesota faces a different, but equally pressing situation. With Justin Jefferson in his prime and a supporting cast capable of competing in the NFC, the Vikings can't afford to waste a season due to inadequate depth planning. Their receiver search reflects an understanding that championship windows are fragile and must be maximized when they're open. The frantic receiver search by these three teams exposes uncomfortable truths about modern NFL roster construction. In an era where passing offense drives success, having adequate depth at receiver isn't a luxury, it's a fundamental requirement for competitiveness. The Jets' situation reveals the dangers of complacency and poor planning. Their receiver room didn't deteriorate overnight. It's the result of multiple off-seasons of inadequate investment and questionable decision-making. The 49ers' struggles highlight how quickly depth can be exposed when key players underperform or suffer injuries. Minnesota's scramble demonstrates that even well-constructed rosters can be vulnerable to unforeseen circumstances. What happens in the next few days will likely determine whether these teams enter the season as legitimate contenders or cautionary tales about the importance of depth. The desperation is real, the stakes are enormous, and the clock is ticking toward a deadline that will separate the prepared from the panicked. The beauty of this situation lies in its unpredictability. Will one team's desperation lead to an overpay that solves their problems while creating opportunities for others? Or will the limited supply of quality receivers leave all three teams scrambling for inferior solutions? The answers will shape not just these teams' immediate futures, but potentially the entire landscape of this NFL season. Which team do you think is in the most desperate situation, and who's most likely to find a solution that actually moves the needle? The receiver market is about to explode, and your prediction about who wins and loses in this scramble could be the insight that cuts through all the noise. Drop your thoughts below, and let's see who has the best read on this wild situation.